So hi everyone, my name is Noomi Weinryb and I'm not a historian. I have a PhD in business studies and my research field is really organization theory. So I'm interested in organizational dynamics, organization mechanisms that cause organizing or that interact and somehow relate to organizing. And those are the questions I ask when I study philanthropy. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to share some data with you to give you a sense of what I've seen when I study philanthropy, and then also what questions that data, or which questions that data may raise in terms of philanthropy and philanthropic engagement in Sweden today. And this is fairly recent data, which I think may also be relevant to your future discussions today. With that said, I should also say that this data is still not published, which means that it might be a little bit complicated to look at. I have not yet created the best tools to explain that data, so I will speak, and there will be more questions to ask about the data that you can ask me later. So this is just to give you sort of a sense of what's going on in terms of research. So what I'm going to do is, oh, there's a dot that jumped there. I'm both going to talk about the independently wealthy, elite philanthropy, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about micro-philanthropy solicited through social media, because these are two separate research projects that I'm working on. Okay. So, the first study I did has to do with elite philanthropy, and this is about research funders. So the question that I want you to ask to the data, and that we'll try to talk about, is who do philanthropists share information with, and how do they motivate their funding decisions? I have data on Sweden, California specifically actually, and Korea. But I took out Korea for the purposes of today, because I think just the complexity of comparing Sweden and California will be sufficient. So what I did when I did this study was that I said philanthropists don't fund in a vacuum. Philanthropists fund in a context where there are other funders around, and those funders have different types of funding mechanisms. So I took something which is called a resource dependence perspective. I said, where do the funders get their funds, and how does that relate to a number of different things that the funders do? And I think this is important, and it's not that common, because when you research philanthropy, you usually only research philanthropy. You don't think about philanthropy as one type of funding in a context where there is other funding around, and I think this is very important. So I took a very limited field, and I compared that field between countries. I looked at research funding, and more specifically, I looked at funding of human embryonic stem cell research, which is a controversial type of funding, but also a type of funding where civil society and philanthropists have been very active, especially in the US. So this is an extreme case, we call it. So the types of funders I looked at and that I distinguished between were corporations, which are funded through sales and investments. Broadly speaking, this is an ideal type classification. I looked at public agencies in a broad sense funded by tax, and then I distinguished between fundraising dependent nonprofits, because I said, you know, if you're dependent on raising money continuously, you will perhaps act differently than if you are independently wealthy. That is, you're not dependent, whatever you do when you fund is not related to if you will have more funds, other than that you might eat up your capital, but there is no direct connection there in terms of keeping your brand going. So these are the four categories. Okay. This is just some details of it. So I did 101 interviews covering 51 funding organizations. So some interviews, some organizations, there were several interviews. So this is knowledge sharing in California. So just to explain to you, NP means fundraising nonprofits, PA means public agency, C means corporation, and Phil means philanthropy. So I want you to look at the green dots. Those are the philanthropists. And this is how the funders themselves, this is called a social network analysis. This is how the funders themselves say that they share knowledge within this particular network. And for anyone who's interested, I can explain how I gathered those funders and how that network analysis was conducted. But the basic idea and the interesting idea is that philanthropists really don't share much knowledge in this funding context, whereas the others do share knowledge with each other. There is one philanthropist, if you look far to the left, that does share knowledge, and that nonprofit is actually a grantee of that funder. So they share some knowledge. Other than that, the philanthropists are really on their own. This is Sweden. So if you look at the green dots, I think that you can see that this is a slightly different funding environment. The philanthropists are highly engaged with other funders. Some of them are even quite central. Now, the size of the dots is related to how many ties they have. That's the indication of the graph. So we have this idea about knowledge sharing and interactions between funders is different in this context, and philanthropists really being more independent, standoffish, depends on how you define it in the US funding environment. All right. Now, I asked about motivations for funding. Why did you fund this type of research? Now, this is when I talk about the data not being perfect for presentation, the colors shift. So now the purple ones are the philanthropists. You should look at the purple columns. These are the motivations that came out of my interviews. Why the funders funded human embryonic stem cell research. So there were a couple of reasons. One was the clinical promise. This would actually help patients. One was that this would be a research tool. The stem cells could be tools that could then help other types of research. One was scientific progress in a broad sense. We just want to fund science for science's own sake because it's good science. One was personal reasons. This relates to me. I've been ill, or I know the researcher, so it's very personal. One is to supplement federal funds, and in the case of human embryonic stem cell research, this had to do with the state not funding this type of research on a federal level in the US, but also the EU actually in Sweden, and this some of you may not know, was not funding this research either. So on the federal level, if you compare California and Sweden, there is actually a comparative context. One was economic growth. This is going to just, this is a good type of research that will just promote economic growth in our society. One is that we were told to do so. There was a higher agency that told us to do so. And one is just that this is a business case for this particular company because there were corporations involved. So here, public agencies, and the N is for the organizations, not the... No, the N is for the respondents, sorry. So public agencies are blue, corporations are red, fundraising nonprofits are green, and the philanthropists are purple. And if you look at this graph, you can see that philanthropists in this US context, they motivated the funding of human embryonic stem cell research in quite a homogeneous way. They said, we do this because the state doesn't do it. And then we said, we do this because this relates to me and my own personal history. None of them talked about scientific progress. None of them talked about research tool. And remember, this is research funding, right? And none of them talked specifically about clinical promise. Now, what's the case in Sweden? Keep your eyes on the purple. Oops. All right, now. See the difference? All Swedish philanthropists talked about scientific progress. Now let's look at some quotes. And I mean, there's much to talk about here that is not about philanthropists, but we keep to that now because it's the purpose of this talk. Okay, now I'm going to try and move my head. This is just some quotes to give you a sense of how people talked, and it's in bold, the sort of the most important part of the quote. So one philanthropist said, during the Bush administration, the federal government basically wouldn't fund stem cell research, period. The consequence of that was that if you had private money, you could do it. As a consequence of that, if you had private money, you could do anything you wanted. There were no guidelines in the US. It should not be our job to do what was really the government's job and create guidelines, but if we didn't do it, nobody was going to do it. And then this other philanthropists, and these are, yeah, anonymized, but there are no names in here other than Bill. We were interested in doing so, that is funding human embryonic stem cell research, at the time when the federal government was restricting and not willing to fund this kind of research. We decided that this was important scientific medical research and needs to be funded. And that's why we went into it. So here there is some science coming into it, but it's not the primary motivation. And here is the personal. So this is a person who's been ill, and she's been saved by a researcher named Bob. And this is what she says. Actually, Bob called me and he said, you know, I'm going to need some help to pursue the research that I'm doing so I can make some real breakthroughs. And here are some of the cases where, frankly, I do not have the tools to cure that problem. I told him that I would back him on those. You have the talent, you have the vision, and I'm going to help you. And if you see on top, she says, I'm so lucky, the chance of my surviving was so slim. If it were not for Bob, I would not be here. So it's very connected to Bob. And really anything Bob will say, she wants to help him because he saved her life. Now here's Sweden. We certainly regard it as any project and consider the scientific quality. That is what governs us, nothing else. Scientific quality is the only criterion for evaluation. And then when I ask about it, someone else says, it simply has not been in any particular special position either way, whether in terms of supporting or not supporting. But it's there as an interesting research if performed in a good way. So there's stark differences in how you think about why you fund the same type of research, really. So what do we see? Philanthropists, and this is broad generalizations now from a small data set, so it's more sort of to give you ideas to think further about, are more alike within the society they operate in rather than across societies. And this may have implications for promoting philanthropy in Sweden. It's just not necessarily the same kind of thing. And this is sort of the takeaway. Now I want to very quickly, not as much data here, talk to you about another study I'm doing about microphilanthropy on a mass scale. I'm looking at the refugee, some call it crisis, or the situation that occurred in the fall of 2015, where I'm looking at about 90 Swedish pages and groups. It's thousands of pages of text and images that organized in this crisis. Both established organizations and so-called loosely organized networks. So here we have many people giving small amounts of money. And it's a more contemporary phenomena than research funding. So here are a couple of things that I see in the data, and this is work in progress. There are texts, some of them coming out sooner and some of them still very early on here. Some challenges with this. Control is the main challenge. People were giving money to other people who just put up their phone numbers. So you could swish the money. This is a Swedish technique, or it's maybe occur in other countries, but and it doesn't occur in the US. You can actually just transfer the money through a phone number. If you have a Swedish bank account. People were giving to personal bank accounts that other people just put up. So all the sort of infrastructure of control that we've established was not valued at all. There were other things that were important. And I think this says something critical about engagement today. This says something critical about the proneness of people to give, their idea about the individual being able to make the call of when and where it's appropriate to give, rather than leaning on established structures. And I think even though it's not big gifts, then it's important. Then we have other trends here. Time, money is gathered very quickly. This is important. Logistics, it's very hard to coordinate donations and to create efficient logistics. It's very hard to match commitment and need. There is also competition between organizations and networks, and also between networks when things happen this quickly. There are a lot of rumors, and there is a challenge in terms of boundaries. Where should this money go? What is really the boundary of the mandate of the people who has received the money, when it's so unclear why that person has received the money? So there's all sorts of challenges in this new trend. And here I would say that what we can see and what we can bring with us in terms of discussions today is that micro-philanthropic engagement through social media organization is fast. But there is a price for it. There's poor logistics and scaling of engagement. There is less control over funds collected, and there are more rumors. Thank you.